All right, for the first project, we're going to focus on doing something together, but focusing on layers and some of the things that you need to know, the basics about layers. Right now, I just want you to watch. In a couple minutes, I'm actually going to start the project with different files. But right now, let me just go over some basics with you. So I want you to notice that in the work area, you see a big red square. That's because currently in my layers palette, and so notice over here where it says layers, you're going to notice, you can see some of the thumbnail images of the different layers that I have. You'll notice that there's a red layer that's on top. That is why you can see the red layer and you don't see anything else underneath it. Because I've basically just dumped paint over this entire image, it's covering up anything that's underneath it. So since it completely fills the screen, the blue layer underneath it, the green layer underneath that, and then this crazy picture of a caricature of me is all the way at the bottom, but you can't see any of that because the layers are stacked on top of each other, so you can't see what's underneath them if they completely fill the work area. So one thing that you can do with layers is you can always change the order of layers. So for example, I can click and drag on the blue layer and bring it above the red layer. So now you see the blue layer here. I can click on the green layer and bring it above, so you'll see it at the top there. I could click on the bottom layer and bring it up. So you can see how you can change the order of the layers. And because the way I've set this image up, since all the layers are completely full of pixels, you don't see anything that's underneath any of those layers. You're going to see in the first project that that's not exactly going to be the case. Okay, so a couple other things here that I want to point out about layers. So when you, by default, when you create layers, they usually just have generic names like layer 1, layer 2. If you bring in a file with a name, it might have the name of the file or whatever, but you can rename any of these layers. So for example, I can just double click on the name and simplify this to caricature. Just type that in, hit enter. So you can double click on any of the names to change their name. Okay. Additionally, you can also change the visibility of layers. If you look carefully in my layers palette, you're going to see these little eye icons, which are currently open, basically, which means that layers are visible. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the eye icon in this very top layer, and you're going to notice that that layer disappears. It's still there. You can see it in the layers palette, but I've made it invisible, basically. Sometimes in Photoshop, you'll know that you want to get something out of the way so you can work on something else, for example. So that's how you can turn the visibility on and off. I can turn the visibility off of the layers underneath, but you don't notice it because this layer is on top. If I turn all the visibility off, you can see we have this checkerboard pattern, which means transparent, basically meaning no pixels there whatsoever. All right, let's talk about creating new layers. Down at the bottom of the layers palette, you're going to see several icons here. The ones that we're going to focus on are the two all the way on the right. The little square with the plus sign, which is going to add a layer, and then the little trash can, which we can delete a layer that we don't want. Right now, I want you to notice that the only layer that's highlighted is this caricature layer. The other three layers are not active at the moment. The active layer is the one that I have highlighted here, the caricature layer. When you add a new layer, the new layer will always go directly above whatever layer is currently selected. So if I click the plus sign now, it adds a new layer called layer 1 above that. In the work area, you're going to notice that looks like nothing changed. That's because you can see this checkerboard pattern, this gray and white checkerboard pattern. That is Photoshop's way of indicating invisibility or transparency. There are no pixels on layer 1. It is completely blank, so nothing is covering up the images below it. That's why you can see through it. If I were to, for example, grab my paintbrush, and I'll just make a nice big paintbrush here. Okay, I have layer 1 selected and start painting on this. You can see how that starts to cover up what's underneath it. The key is I have layer 1 selected. That's why the paint went on layer 1. That's very important. If I had, I'm going to go ahead and actually let's go ahead and delete this layer now. So I'm going to have it, there's a couple ways you can delete. If I have it selected here, I can just click the trash can, it'll go away. I'm going to undo that though. I'm going to go back to my history and undo that and go back to that layer right there. Okay, I can also drag it to the trash and drop it. Both of those are acceptable ways to delete. So as I mentioned, when you create a new layer, the new layer will go above whatever layer is currently active. So for example, I have the green layer active right now. I'm going to go ahead and hit the plus sign. Notice that goes in between those two layers. All right, I'm going to delete that layer, get rid of it. All right, I'm going to drag the character layer below the green layer. And let's talk about the layer opacity. So you'll notice right now that you cannot see through the green layer at all. You can't see anything underneath it. In the layers palette, there's a couple of choices which we'll use a little bit. The first one is this blend mode, but I'm not going to talk about blend mode right now, but we'll use this in a couple of projects. And basically what's happening is it's taking this layer and blending it with the layer underneath through some mathematical formulas, but we're not going to talk about that one right now. The default blend mode is normal, which just means it doesn't blend at all with the layer underneath it. But let's talk about opacity right now. By default, the opacity of a layer is 100%. If I take that, you can type in a value, but you also can click on the arrow and do a little slider bar. So notice what's happening now. Basically, I'm fading out. Like right now, the opacity of the green layer is at 27%. And as I increase it, you can see that it's harder and harder to see what's underneath it. So sometimes you will blend layers together. That's not actually accurate, not blending. But you'll change the opacity of a layer so you can see something that's underneath it. That is something that is fairly common in Photoshop as well. All right, the last thing I want to point out to you here in this is I'm going to go ahead and bring this character layer back to the top. I mentioned this earlier. I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer. So layer one, I'm on layer one. I have my paintbrush selected. I can pick a color for my paintbrush. It can be whatever we want. And I am painting right now on layer one. Notice in my thumbnail, you can see the paint is on layer one. So the nice thing is if I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I don't like that, I can go to my eraser tool, and I have a very strange brush selected, but that's okay. I'm just going to go ahead and start erasing some of that, okay? I actually hate the brush I have selected right now. I just do a normal brush, okay? And so I'm erasing the paint, but notice I'm not damaging the caricature image. That's because I'm on layer one. That's what's active. This is something that new users struggle with. You have to be careful, okay? If, for example, I'm going to select the caricature layer and go back to my paintbrush and do some more painting. Oh, it's not going to let me. Hang on. Don't worry about what I'm doing right now. Well, actually, did I talk about this in previous videos? I did actually. I just had to rasterize that. All right, so now I'm painting again. In the work area, it just looks normal, like I'm painting, but now look at my layers palette. On the caricature layer, I put a bunch of paint on it. Here's what that means. I'm going to turn the visibility of layer one off. I can't erase this paint now without also erasing the face of that. And you might say, well, you're just painting with green. No, I'm not. Look, I'm erasing and showing the green layer underneath. If I put the blue layer above the green layer, look, it's going to turn blue. So you need to be very, very careful. Oh, I'm erasing the blue layer now, see? And I'm showing that underneath. You have to be very careful that the work you're doing is on the layer you need it to be on. All right, that's the basics of layers. There's a lot more to them, but that allows us to work pretty well here in class. All right, so the next video, let's do a project together, focusing